Hi everyone, this is Jim. There's two parts to this video. I was going to talk briefly about a new feature in Lichess, and then I was going to do a post-mortem of a King's Gambit game that I played recently. So for the first part, the new feature you see right away if you log on to Lichess is now the first screen that comes up. It's these rating pools. These are different, or pairing pools maybe I should call them. You can choose one of these time controls, and it will try and match you up against someone who's also selected that same time control. So this is like the ICC 5-minute pool, but with a lot of different options. So there's a 3-minute, a pure 3-minute, a pure 5-minute, but then there's also 3 minutes with 2-second increment and 5 minutes with 3-second increment, which is the time control that I prefer. And then you click on that and you see it goes to a waiting mode where it is waiting to match you up against someone who's also in that pool. And then you click it again to turn it off, to leave the pool. So it tries to match you up against someone who's in the neighborhood of your rating. And then over time, as it has to wait longer, it expands the range of ratings that it looks at. So if you have to wait a long time, it'll, rather than make you wait forever, it'll expand out and give you a somewhat of a mismatched opponent, perhaps. But anyway, I've had pretty good luck with it. It seems to find some good matches for me. And it's a nice feature. It's a feature that Chess Explained, for example, has been asking ICC to add for a long time, and they've always refused. They're sticking with their 5-minute pools, although they did add a 25 and 10, but that's pretty slow. That's a rapid time control rather than a blitz time control. So let's see. The second thing that was going on was that you can also just choose, 5 and 3 by setting them over here manually and then asking, and then somebody will see your, there's the traditional interface, someone will see your request and decide whether or not to play you. The difference is that that there's a choice involved. So in some way it's not quite as fair, you might say, because there's a selection, there's some kind of selection bias there. Your opponents, if they're higher rated, maybe they don't want to play you because they think you're too low rated. I have noticed that when I go with this type of setup that I mostly get lower rated players challenging me and maybe looking to move up. Anyway, I use the 8 and 4 time control for my games that I'm recording, and I use the 5 and 3 time control when I'm just playing for fun. So I was happy to see that 5 and 3 show up here as one of the pools that they have. My own rating suffered recently in the 5 and 3. Let's see, this is the 8 and 4 is played at this classical time control, and that's been in the neighborhood of 2000 for a while now. And my faster time control, the blitz time control they call it, these were the 5 and 3 games I was playing. This was around 1800, got up to around 1850 there at the peak. And so I was pretty solidly in this area, and then I had this run of games where I was just losing and losing. So I had a terrible slump I was trying to break, and that's why I started experimenting with different openings like the King's Gambit. And then sometime around here was when they introduced the rating pool, and I started playing in the rating pool, and I've been pretty happy with that. It kind of, like I said, it matches you up against opponents just based on who's nearby in rating. You face both stronger and weaker opponents there. It seems fairly even. So let's take a look at this game that I played there. As one of the things that I was trying to do to break out of my slump, I was trying different openings, just trying to mix it up. And I went back to an opening I used to play in the old days, quite a long time ago, which is the King's Gambit. I kind of had given this up because for a couple of reasons. One is that E5 was not so common a response. There was a time when I almost never saw E5. People were playing Sicilians and other openings, and no one was going with E5. But it's come into fashion now that all the top players are playing it as a way to equalize against E4. You see it more often amongst club players and blitz players. So it's now a possibility to get this position pretty frequently. The second reason I gave it up, particularly for over-the-board play, is there's so many different ways for black to play here that it was just too much for me to try and learn it all. So there would be, I would study these interesting lines in the King's Gambit, and then I would never get them over the board because my opponent would play something completely different. So let's talk a little bit about the opening. Right here, black has a couple of interesting choices besides just taking. If you put this on a chess engine, the chess engine says that just taking the pawn is good for black, and so I think that's the most principled way to play. But if you want to avoid the gambit, you can decline the gambit by playing bishop c5. There's this little trick where, in fact, this pawn looks like it's hanging, but it's not safe for white to take that pawn because of the queen check. Well, just to put it on the board, if he takes here, then the queen comes out, checks the king, and I think if the king tries to run away, it gets in big trouble pretty quickly. But if you block, then this check picks up the rook in the corner. So that's just losing for white. So white needs to play a move like knight f3. It gives you time to play d6. So you've got an active bishop outside the pawn chain. White's got an open f-file to play with, and it's about equal prospects for both sides. Another way to avoid the main line King's Gambit is to play the counter gambit, the Falkbeer counter gambit. That's where d5 is played right here in response to f4. And this is an interesting counter gambit, and this also, if you look at it with a chess engine, seems to be about equal. So those are lines where black can equalize without taking the risk of grabbing that gambit pawn. So one line here, I guess the main line of the Falkbeer counter gambit goes something like this. He takes, and black pushes, and then white can go with d3, turn this into a real gambit, and try and get some development out of this. Black plays knight f6, white grabs, black grabs, and we get this kind of crazy position, knight f3, bishop c5, queen e2. So I'll stop here. Let's count the pawns. Yeah, white is still a pawn up, so black has successfully gambited a pawn, and he's got this kind of annoying pressure on e2, although the knight is pinned. So you got to watch out for that. The knight can't come into f2, but yeah, it's interesting and complicated. So that's another way for black to play if black wants to take the gambit away from white and play a gambit himself. That's just kind of interesting. Oddly enough, the chess engine likes the second choice here. So let's go back. So it's d5, the Falkbeer counter gambit. White takes is a normal response. And then there is a second option for black here. Instead of just pushing the pawn, he could also take the f-pawn. And this gets into a position where the material is even. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Actually, I take that back. It's not. It's only even for a second. For a second there, the material was even because the black had the doubled f-pawn, white had the doubled d-pawn. But white ends up, cancel that, gambiting that d-pawn, and then castling. So black is a pawn up in this line, and white has typical kind of counterplay. And this seems to be okay for black, though. So it's a little bit of more of an open position than black usually gets in a King's Gambit. So a little easier development for black. Seems like this should be all right. Anyway, both those are interesting ways for black to play if he wants to avoid the main line. But like I said, if you look at this with the chess engine, it'll tell you you should just take that pawn. And why not? So knight f3, and then the main move here is g5. g5 holds on to the pawn, but more importantly what it does is it blunts this bishop. This bishop now can't develop to either the e3 square or the f4 square, whereas a lot of times it comes out and takes on f4 if given the chance. So, you know, black's kingside pawn structure is a little bit crazy, and this is where all the main lines of the King's Gambit lie, starting with h4 here. All different kinds of ways to play from this point on. So I won't go any further into the main lines because my opponent diverged right here. We got to this point after knight f3. He played the move bishop c5, which I was surprised to find. It's actually in the database, but it's not. It seems a very good move because I have d4 here, kicking it, gaining a tempo. And I'm pretty happy I can just grab this f-pawn right away. Let's see, I didn't. I developed first. I played bishop c4. This is also the book line. He went knight f6. and then I took. So the chess engine says the way to keep some kind of advantage is actually not to allow him to take that e-pawn, but to play knight to c3. So, there's two pawns hanging here. The e-pawn is hanging and the f-pawn is hanging. Black maybe is a little reluctant to take the e-pawn because there are potential pins on the e-file, but, well, after bishop takes f4, apparently it's safe. It's safe for black to take that pawn. Anyway, my opponent didn't care to test that out. Well, let's take a look at that line. It was kind of interesting. If he takes the pawn here, I would certainly go for the pin. He could support that knight with d5. I can play knight c3 here, because if he takes my bishop, I can take his knight, so that the knight is not actually hanging here. Bishop a5, knight d2. Bishop a5 was pinning. Knight d2 to break the pin. Bishop takes, pawn takes. Kind of a crazy line. If it weren't for the pin, the knight would be threatening to take some things over here. But, well, he'll probably unpin with queen e7 at some point, and I'll have to save my bishop. Anyway, interesting and complicated, but it looks like black would be better if he had gone that way, better than in the game at least. Let's see, he castled. The advantage, by the way, just keeps shifting back and forth. After he castles, I have a good move here in bishop g5, which I didn't play. I played the move e5. I was tired of defending that pawn, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to push it forward. And he went knight h5. But he actually had another chance to play this d5 move, and that would have been good for black. He went knight h5, so now I am doing okay, but only if I find the move bishop to g5. So, but this is a nice move. Bishop to g5. He is harassing the queen, and it's exploiting this pin. It's nice that you've got this bishop out here pinning the f-pawn, so he can't just block it with f6. He has to move the queen, and it gets my bishop away from being traded. So that would be good. I didn't see that idea, and let's back up. After I played d5, he went knight h5. I went queen d2, just defending the bishop, and he traded it off. I think we end up back in a position where it's about even. He once again goes with d5, and now I take en passant, and he takes with the queen. And this is something that often happens with these gambit openings and these tactical openings, is that well, things open up quickly and a lot of material gets traded. In this case, the queens come off. There wasn't a particularly good retreat. Now I have time to castle, and a slight edge to white in this position. So I came out of the opening okay. Didn't have any disadvantage. Let's see. The material is even. That's true. He never grabbed, or he grabbed the f-pawn, but I got it back. So yeah, the material is even. He has an isolated pawn here. I have a little more space, but it's only a very slight edge, and probably black can defend this position. But well, what I was going to say is, if you play these gambit openings, you often have to become an expert in the endgame because so often the tactical lines induce a lot of trades, and you end up in an endgame. So something to keep in mind. Let's see, it's black's move. He played bishop f5, played c3, he went rook e8. All good developing moves. Although for some reason, well, this is logical. The chess engine likes knight d7 better than rook e8. But these are all okay moves, I guess. Let's see, he went rook e8. I went knight bd2. I went knight c6. And went bishop to b5. So pinning this knight against the rook. He kicks my bishop, and I drop back. I notice that he can't break the pin with b5 because his bishop is in the way. So I can keep that annoying pin on there for a while. But he finds a nice way to break the pin. He lifts his rook and invades. So he's playing well, I think. He's activating his pieces and playing this the way you should. Even though it's an endgame, there's a lot of force on the board still. You've got to just optimize what you're doing with your pieces. In fact, there's enough force here. I guess you could view this as a queenless middle game more than an endgame. But anyway, I noticed there's this kind of pin on my knight, and I didn't want to be tied down defending this knight forever. So I pushed the b pawn forward. The chess engine is not at all worried about that and just drops the bishop back to b3, which is an interesting square for the bishop. I'm just taking a look at the f7 square, and maybe later there'll be some coordination with the knight, the rook, and the bishop all pointing at f7. But anyway, I went b4, just got my pawn out of the line of fire, and I'm thinking of pushing it forward here and maybe causing trouble. Let's see, what did he play here? He went rook a to e8. And so right here, there's a little tactic. So if you want to see if you can spot the moves for the move for white here, or the plan for white, go ahead and pause the video. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. So it's kind of a two-move tactic. It starts with the move knight to c4. So I get the knight away from that the pressure of the rook, but I'm attacking. The main point is that I'm attacking this loose bishop here. So I get that move knight c4 with tempo. The bishop drops back, and then I get the move d5, attacking the pinned knight. Let's see, was there a reason I couldn't play d5 immediately? Yeah. I had the bishop. That was the problem. The bishop has got my my d pawn pinned, so that's why knight to c4 is a necessary starting move for this tactic. You chase the bishop off of that diagonal. So he could have actually maintained that pin by dropping back to a7. But anyway, I get this this little tactic against his knight, and now he could have played b5, and then things really get complicated. After b5, let's see, I take his knight, he takes my bishop, and then I have knight d4, which is a fork of his bishop and his rook. And oddly enough, this rook can't go to a square that protects the bishop. That's usually the way you would get out of a fork like that. But he can counterattack. Let's see, he's got bishop to d3 is an interesting move here. And, well, it just goes on and on. Very, very tactical situation. Another kind of interesting feature of these positions is that even after some heavy pieces have been traded, there still seems to be lots of residual tactics. Anyway, he went knight to e5, which makes my life a little bit easier. The engine wants me to take the rook. But well, this wasn't so clear to me. If I take the rook, he could take my knight. My knight is loose, and my bishop is hanging. And I drop back. He's got this check, and then he's got rook to b2, and he has pretty active pieces in compensation for being down the exchange. Let's see, let's count. I've got 2 rooks and 2 pieces. Yeah, he's got 1 rook and 3 pieces. And yeah, he's just got very active pieces, and he's got the bishop pair. It seems like it's kind of tricky. But the chess engine points out there's this move, bishop takes f7 check, sacrificing the bishop. This is kind of cool. King takes, and then knight to d4, hitting the rook. And we get this fork again, hitting the bishop. But this time the bishop is pinned, and it looks like I get some material back in that line. Anyway, some interesting lines there. What happened? I just took the knight off. I figured he would take back, and I could still win the exchange there. But now he plays b5, blocking my bishop. So I took that pawn. I think I get a pawn out of this at the end. But oddly enough, the chess engine is not impressed with this position and thinks that black is doing fine here. So all in all, the evaluation has kind of been swinging back and forth between white and black. An interesting game. He throws in this check, bishop b6 check. You go king h1, and now he goes rook c2, going after my loose pawns here, which is a weakness of my position, that this pawn is being held back by his advanced b pawn. But anyway, there's a problem with that move. So based on some of the tactics you've seen previously, you ought to be able to spot the response that I came up with right here. Okay, pause the video if you want some time to think about it. I'm going to give the answer away. The move I played here was knight to d4, forking the rook and the bishop. he tried this bishop d3 move, which is a nice try. You know, it's getting away from my knight and attacking a rook, and maybe, you know, I take his rook, he takes my rook. It might work out okay, but I have a nice way to escape this, which is rook to e1. And there's a big threat here. If I take his rook, that's mate. So he has to take, and I take back, and there's still a mate threat. So because of that, I gain a tempo. Let's see, he plays a move to save his king, and then I grab the exchange. So I end up the exchange up after all of that, and I still have an extra pawn. There's 4 versus 2 on this side, 3 versus 2 on this side. So being up the exchange and a pawn is usually a winning edge. Let's see, but the game continues for a little bit longer. I play rook to c1. The bishop goes back to e4. Yeah, you know, he's winning a pawn back, so I guess I don't get to keep my extra pawn. I play c4. He took, I took, and he took on d5, opening himself up for one last tactic. So you see the final tactic of the game here. Okay, I'm giving the answer away. That pawn was really protected because I have this check, and it's a fork. So king moved, and I grabbed the bishop, and he resigned at this point. So anyway, a cute game, a good example of how tactics can persist in a position, even as the material comes off. So you always have to be tactically alert at every stage of the game. Hope you guys like this, and I will see you again soon. Bye.